Nice over there. All right, so you guys are done with your quiz. Let's just start. Let me just say a prayer to start the week, and then we talk about some other issues. All right. Heavenly Father God, thank you so much for loving us and for being there for us. Thank you so much for our students as they go through this time in their life where they learn you have your purpose for their life, oh God. They're trying to attain that. Watch over them. I pray for their study habits to be intact and that they embrace the education and they embrace what you have in mind for their lives, oh God. You are gracious to us. Help us never to forget that despite everything that befalls us, you are there all the time. Thank you so much for loving us. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys. So tell you what, let me just set up this week and next week for you, and then I'll entertain any questions you have. And today, I want to start chapter 12. We'll finish this on Wednesday. So first of all, you guys just took quiz 3. All right. Hopefully that went well for you. I haven't looked at the scores or anything. Hopefully that went well for you. Just to line things up for you next week. Next week, you have 2 exams to worry about. First of all, you have your lab practicum. So this morning I actually placed a study guide. I kind of reviewed all the different experiments you did, all the different labs that we did. So we have 4 labs. Everything's included there. Let me just say, there's nothing that's going to be outside of that. All right. So tear that study guide apart. You have about a week or so before exam starts. So if you're in classes, except for Panara's class, she's the one who has labs on Monday. Then we have exams from Tuesday to Friday. All right. So all your instructors, they should be communicating with you, except for Panara. She does her own thing. So I know many students are in her class. It's a fun class with her. So she would tell you when her practicums are. Nonetheless, all practicum for the lab, practicum 1 for Bio 205 lab is next week, except for Panaro's class. All right. Now, we also have an exam for the lecture. That's also next week. It covers 2 chapters only. That's chapter 11, airborne diseases, and this one that we're going to start today and finish on Wednesday. This is foodborne and waterborne diseases. All right. So here's what I'm expecting on Wednesday. I should be done with this lecture. So I would have about at least half an hour to answer any questions you might have. Your study guide releases the slides. And hopefully, as I lecture, you're taking little notes. I usually check things off. I say, kind of know this. Hopefully, you've been doing that. But in any case, on Wednesday, I'd save some time for a study session or a question session. You can ask me anything regarding the exam. All right. I haven't written that exam yet, so I'm not sure what to tell you, but that should be written pretty soon. All right. So I'm going to shut up. And then maybe if you guys have questions for me, I'll answer them, and then I'll move along with the lecture. All right.
What day is the exam for the lecture?
Yeah, it's next Wednesday.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I gave you last Wednesday, I told you, hey, you have 2 weeks to study for this, and it's going to be 2 chapters only. And just to prepare you for the next exam, I always want you to think ahead. That would be chapter 13 and 14, so 2 other chapters. All right? Other questions?
I have one. So you're saying the exam is next Wednesday, which would be the 30th, correct? Instead of the syllabus says the 5th.
All right, this is exam 2?
Yeah.
All right, so it'd be next Wednesday.
Okay, thank you.
Which would be the 30th. Other questions?
When will you post the study guide for the lecture exam?
Like I said, basically we only have 2 chapters, so the study guide really is the names of the organisms, the disease they cause, and symptoms. It's just your slides.
Thank you.
All right. Other questions? Believe it or not, we're on the 5th week. So, man, things are happening pretty fast. All right. Okay, so if you guys have other questions, don't hesitate to bring them up even while I'm talking. No problem there. All right. I'm sure if you have a question, some other person is probably thinking about the same thing. All right. So one more thing about exams. Please study every day. I've been talking to students who are doing really well. And I've just been getting a couple of emails from them and asking them what are they doing. But there's things I've said before. Study every day. A couple hours here, a couple hours there. What you don't want to do, of course, is study the day of the exam or the day before. So that's not going to help. There's so much information, right? So it's very difficult to retain all of that stuff. All right, guys. This next chapter has to do with foodborne and waterborne diseases. So you're already thinking this is enteric diseases, diseases that can affect the intestinal tract. All right. So I want to spend some time talking about the different categories of things that can cause disease in humans. And here's your objective. But here's what I'm going to be talking about when we're done with, after I'm done with this lecture on this chapter. You should learn a little about oral infections, the major things, especially endocarditis, all right, that starts in the oral cavity. I'll tell you about this in a bit. Then we're going to talk about non-inflammatory gastroenteritis, caused primarily by intoxications. I know I'm saying words, but we're going to discover what intoxication means. Primarily Staph aureus, Clostridium perfringens, Clostridium botulinum, and Bacillus cereus. Then I'm going to talk about inflammatory gastroenteritis. I have a whole bunch of interesting organisms here. We're going to focus on the more significant ones. And then finally, we're going to end up talking about invasive gastroenteritis. So think about the term invasive. These bacteria digging into tissues. And again, sometimes they can end up in the bloodstream. All right? So here's a brief review of the digestive system. And again, this is not a class in anatomy or anything, so I won't test you on this. But I do want you to understand the sites that we'll be looking at. So first of all, when you eat, of course, you have food in the mouth. This is the oral cavity. Sometimes we have infection that begins here. And again, typically they're normal flora. So you can have infections in the mouth and then it ends up in the heart. So that's called endocarditis. So we're going to make a link with bacteria that you find in the oral cavity and to a very serious disease called endocarditis. That's the first thing we'll be talking about today. The esophagus here, not much infection. The stomach, very little. Most organisms die in the high acidity of the stomach. And then we have the intestinal tract. Of course, most problems occur here. When you hear about Salmonella, Shigella, E. coli, this is what we're looking at, all right? Okay, so we're going to spend most of our time talking about disease and pathogens that affect the intestinal tract. All right, just to remind you, we have a ton of normal flora on us. This is called the human microbiome. This is the normal microbial flora. And they're going to have a whole list of names. I don't memorize them. This is just a partial list. You have hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of different species that naturally inhabit the digestive system. I'm going to focus on the few that cause some miserable problems in humans, all right? So the first group of disease I want to talk about are diseases that originate in the oral cavity. And then you might have disease in the oral cavity, but they go to the heart. And you end up with something called endocarditis, all right? Endocarditis. So again, I want to talk about this disease. So first of all, just some terminologies for you. Don't worry about memorizing names yet. We're going to come across these in a bit. I want to talk about dental caries, gingivitis, and periodontitis. Let me just say, this is a table. For every different set of diseases, I have these tables for you. It's a nice little resource. You can look at the tables. It gives you a sense of what's really important. Again, just to point out the disease, names of organisms. For this case, it's pretty extensive. I'm going to focus on just a few, all right? And then signs and symptoms for the disease. How they're transmitted, all right? I don't ask you too much about treatment. And prevention can be basically self-explanatory. Brushing teeth, for example, good oral hygiene in this case. All right, some terminologies for you. Dental plaque. What is a plaque? A plaque, it's a buildup of bacterial cell and debris in the mouth. And believe it or not, somebody has very severe plaque. You can have 200 layers of bacterial cells building up on the teeth. Of course, this is bacteria microscopic, so you have millions of billions of organisms that form plaque. Dental caries, this is the technical name for tooth decay. So carie refers to this decay. Peri means around, periodontal disease. So this is a disease which affects what we call periodontal tissues, the alveolar bone, ligaments, cementum, and the gingiva. All right, so this is a general term. Specifically, right over here, gingivitis. You hear that term a lot, right? The gingiva is the gum. So itis is inflammational. This is inflammation of the gum. All right, let me just show you a few pictures. And I'm going to make a link with disease that can occur in the oral cavity and again to something called endocarditis. All right? So plaque, bacterial plaque. These are false colored, but they're true images. if you take a look, there's severe plaque that occurs right here and right there. Really, it's a biofilm. So again, a biofilm, I'll show you a picture in a second. It's a layers and layers and layers of bacterial cells. They're all cemented together, all right? Gingivitis, again, it's inflammation of the gums. Typically, try to picture this. I have plaque building up, right? You put pressure on tissues. You might even break into the gum tissue. And what can occur is inflammation. So in bad cases, you can have ulcers being formed. In other words, you can have bleeding in the gum line. So what contributes to this significantly is the buildup of plaque. If this biofilm gets pretty thick, all right, you're going to end up with dental plaque that breaks into tissues. You can have inflammation in the tissue, and you end up with gingivitis, periodontal disease in particular, all right? I mentioned to you a biofilm. What is a biofilm? Imagine this is the tooth surface here. I have bacteria that can stick to the enamel, all right? So you have many different species that can basically, they form a lining. This is the first lining, and they produce like a cement. You don't have to worry about that cement is. This is what actually puts everything together. For example, dextran. Dextran is just a linkage of sugar that can hold things together. So at some point, you have hundreds and hundreds of bacteria, thousands and millions and billions actually building plaque. This is a really bad case back here. If you were to do a section of this, this is what you would see. As you can tell right here, there are tons of different organisms, right? You can see rods, you can see spiral organisms. Take a look at these. And then you can see cocci, like right over here, right? So it's not just one organism that actually causes dental plaque. It's a mixture of things, tons of them. And imagine this thing can build up for a long time if you don't take care, or if you don't have good oral hygiene, you don't brush your teeth once or twice, actually twice a day, sometimes more. So basically the microorganisms, they're using the sugars to actually grow and then actually to produce this cement, dextrans, for example, that actually creates the layers in which organisms and bacteria can bind to produce this plaque, all right? So plaque builds up at different times during the day. Imagine this, you woke up at 7 o'clock, the pH of your mouth is neutral. As you eat stuff, especially sugary stuff, or drink sugary drinks, what happens? The pH declines, bacteria start fermenting those sugars, they start replicating their numbers. So we go through this cycle during the day. Normal pH, you have breakfast, every time you eat, you dip the pH. So basically the pH becomes more acidic. And of course, what occurs with this is bacteria, they're building this cement, this dextran, for example, by which these layers can form, all right? By the way, we never really get rid of a plaque 100%. There's always some plaque on the teeth because bacteria actually form a biofilm naturally. They can stick pretty tightly to the surface of the tooth, all right? Okay, I've said all of that stuff to talk about this thing here, all right? There's a disease called infective endocarditis. Now, let's look at the term. Sometimes when you actually analyze the term, you know exactly what it means. So endo means inside. And just to make a little note for you, remember endospores? You guys did the spore stain last week. You saw endospores. This is a spore inside a cell. So it's something inside, but we're not looking at a bacteria. We're looking at endocarditis. So this is infective endocarditis. There's bacteria in this case causing inflammation inside the heart tissue. So if you take a look at this, pretty bad, right? This is taken from autopsy of a person who died because of bacterial endocarditis. So if you've taken Bio 163 last semester, you learned a lot about the heart. Remember, these things are called the chordae tendineae. They hold the heart valves in place. Take a look at this. What happens, bacteria gain access to these sites and they dug into tissues, and over time, of course, they destroy tissues to create inflammation. So this is called infective endocarditis. Now, here's the thing. Why am I linking this to oral diseases? So why did we talk about the mouth and the heart? Well, here's the thing. Most of the time, the bacteria that's causing this disease, all right, they're oral flora bacteria. So check it out. About 80% of this, what you're seeing here, about 80% of this is not coming from the intestinal tract. Bacteria is coming from the oral cavity. These bacteria, streptococci and staphylococcus, all right? They're present as normal flora to begin with in the oral cavity. Now, about 60%, most of the cases actually is the streptococcus species. These bacteria are normal in the mouth. All right. So they're normally in the oral cavity. So what happens? So let's link things. Let's just go back to something like this. All right. Imagine somebody has a bad problem of gingivitis. So you have inflammation of the gum. What happens usually, bacteria from the oral cavity, they can get into the wound. All right. So they're causing the inflammation. So now you have swollen gums. Now you have infection and disease at that site. Now picture what can happen over time. These bacteria can move over time from these areas, get into the bloodstream, and go all the way to the heart. All right. So you see what's happening now? You have normal bacteria from the oral cavity gaining access to the heart to cause a disease called infective endocarditis. All right. So usually the bacteria that we see in this disease, it's bacteria from the oral cavity. You see how significant that is? All right. Now, terminology that I'd like you to get. All right. Subacute bacterial endocarditis, or SBE. It's caused primarily by Streptococcus species. So this is chronic. You guys know what chronic means. It takes a long time. All right. It occurs over a long time. So this is pretty slow, over several weeks to months, even years. So the bacteria, they're present in the heart, they're slowly replicating, increasing their numbers to produce what I just showed you earlier. So that's subacute. The other disease is acute. So acute, basically this means it occurs very suddenly. You see all the basic symptoms occurring at the heights of their peak levels. This is called a fulminant disease. Fulminant simply means this, it's a sudden disease. Now notice this. Staphylococcus aureus is top of the list. So streptococci cause most subacute bacterial endocarditis, and Staphylococcus aureus causes most acute endocarditis. All right. Now, as you'd expect, when you have infection of the heart, you see many different conditions associated with these individuals. For example, fatigue. Blood's not flowing appropriately. The heart's not pumping efficiently. They can have fever and chills because you have an infection, you have inflammation going on. All right, shortness of breath because your heart is trying to keep up with your demands for oxygen. All right. Okay, so those are gram-positive cocci. I'm sure you remember this. Streptococcus and Staphylococcus are gram-positive cocci. What about gram-negative rods? Do they cause disease? Yes, and I do want to point them out for you. There's something called a HACEK group. This is an acronym, HACEK. It's an acronym for the gram-negative organisms. All right. And by the way, these organisms are also present in the oral cavity, just like the staph and the strep. So here's what they are: Haemophilus, Aggregatibacter, Cardiobacterium, Eikenella, and then Kingella. So all of these are organisms that can cause disease in the heart. All right. So let me just do a basic review. We kind of linked normal flora, normal bacteria that you find in the oral cavity to endocarditis, right? We said most endocarditis is caused by Streptococci and then Staphylococcus aureus. Those are gram-positive cocci. There's something called subacute endocarditis. Most of those cases are caused by Streptococci. And there's something called acute bacterial endocarditis. That's a fulminant disease. All that means is a fancy term to say this disease occurs pretty suddenly, pretty rapidly. All right? Primarily caused by Staphylococcus aureus. Now, there are also some gram-negative organisms that can cause this. And again, these organisms, they originate in the oral cavity and they belong to the HACEK group: Haemophilus, Aggregatibacter, Cardiobacterium, E is for Eikenella, and K is for Kingella. All right? So that's it for oral diseases. Now I want to move on to talk about the things that really matters, the substance of this chapter. I want to talk about infection of the rest of the digestive system. All right? And we're going to classify these diseases into two different groups. All right? First of all, we have intoxications. And I want to be very clear how we separate them. You probably heard about staph food poisoning. You probably heard about salmonella, maybe an E. coli infection. Well, how do we actually get those? All right. So when we talk about foodborne and waterborne diseases, basically there are two categories of things that we're looking at. First of all, intoxications. So intoxication is simply this: you're consuming something that already has the toxins in there. And then the toxins are already there. They elaborate their effects in the intestinal tract. Happens pretty rapidly, actually. So the bacteria is not causing the problem anymore. It's the toxin they produce in the foods or that you eat or the water that you drink. All right? We're going to look at 4 different diseases pretty soon, but that's intoxication. So again, intoxication simply means this. You're ingesting toxins that are already there, and they produce diarrhea, cramps, vomiting, and all that stuff. All right? That's intoxication. The other one is infection. With infection, you have to eat or drink something that contains the pathogen. So forget about the toxin. You drink or eat the pathogen, passes through the stomach, gets to the intestinal tract, and they have to compete and grow with flora in the intestinal tract, normal things in the intestinal tract. But once they do that, they can now cause disease. So an infection takes a little longer time, right? I mean, if the toxin's already there, within a few hours, you see symptoms of disease. With infection, you have live organisms causing disease. So they have to basically literally compete with things that are already there. So therefore, the incubation time, so what is the incubation time? So we talked about this earlier. It's the time when you gut something, right? So let's say this is day 0, time 0, and you start seeing mild symptoms, all right? So for intoxication, this is pretty short, relative about 4 to 8 hours or so. You're seeing signs of disease. In other words, vomiting, diarrhea, etc. For infection, that might take days, because maybe a couple of days, usually about 24 to 78 hours. All right, this isn't hours now. This is days. So maybe 36, maybe 48 hours, you can see signs of disease. All right, so that's a distinction between infections and intoxications. Now, the general symptoms that we're looking at, well, they're intestinal diseases, right? So we see diarrhea, abdominal cramps, vomiting on occasions, nausea. And depending on what's causing the problem, we can see your nervous system affected. For example, in the case of botulism, which I'll talk about today. All right. So where do we get these things from? Well, first of all, let's look at the most common one. Most common problem that we see is salmonella. You hear about salmonella all the time. But there are others: Clostridium, E. coli, Campylobacter jejuni, Staph aureus, Shigella listeria. I know I'm naming names. We're going to talk about them. Where do we pick them up? Well, think about this in the restaurant. You go to a restaurant one day, you come back 2 days later, you have severe diarrhea, probably salmonella, right? Home, in the camps, social outings, schools, other sources. What types of food contribute to this? Poultry, chicken, for example, fish, dairy, beef, vegetables. So tons of things can contribute to diseases like this, right? Now, how do we transmit disease from something that's infected or something that contains the pathogen to you? Well, you can have direct contact. In other words, take a look at this right over here, right? Here's let's just picture, let me just step back a bit. What time of the year do we see most of these diseases? It's around Thanksgiving time. So people are making their turkey stuff, their meat, whatever. And what they do, generally speaking, if you buy meat, you can culture any pathogen. All right, there's tons of pathogens on meat. But if you cook things properly, you would not have a problem. So here's one thing that happens all the time: cross-contamination. All right? So imagine this is a good case back here. You're using this knife to cut chicken or meat or beef or turkey or whatever it is. You cook the turkey, and that's fine. There's no bacteria on it that can cause disease. But then you didn't wash the knife, and then you use the knife to make a salad. We know we shouldn't do this, right? But trust me, this is a common way to literally cross-contaminate things, objects with pathogens. Another way is through the fecal-oral route. So in feces, there are pathogens. By some mechanism, it gets into the food or to liquids. You eat or you drink that, and now you come down with the disease. Contaminated water sources. So here's a river. You might have drank water from the river, but there's a dead carcass up there somewhere upstream that has salmonella or shigella, all right? Or improper slaughter. You go to the slaughterhouses, it's not clean environments. In any case, what happens? These organisms are present on the food that we eat or the water that we drink, and now there's a potential to cause disease. All right. So the first group I want to focus on is the one that calls, check it out, non-inflammatory gastroenteritis. Gastro refers to the stomach, enterite refers to the intestinal tract, all right? So we're going to focus primarily on intoxications. Remember what's intoxications? Basically, you consume food that has the toxins there already. Now, typical symptoms that you see is diarrhea, cramps, and vomiting. All right? Now, notice this. For intoxications, the symptoms last for a very short period of time. Check it out right over here. All right? So this is the incubation period. Remember what that means. Here's time 0, and this is when you start seeing symptoms. All right? Notice it's well within hours, not days. Like for infection, it takes a while for the organisms to grow in your system, but you're consuming the toxins here. How long do these things last for? Well, imagine with staph food poisoning, it takes maybe a day or two and it's gone. All right? But the other ones, well within a day. Now, one that's really, really bad is botulism, of course. And we're going to talk about this disease big time today, all right? Okay. Now, I have several slides that I'm going to show you. And I don't want you to memorize everything. I want you to get the gist of this, all right? What's causing disease? What types of symptoms do you see? All right, don't worry so much about treatment. For most of these diseases here, it's going to be oral rehydration therapy. All that means is just fluid replacement. That's simple, right? It's called ORT, oral rehydration therapy. Basically, you drink fluids to replace the fluids that you're losing through diarrhea and sweating and all that, so, and vomiting also, all right? So I want you guys to point at the literally mark the things I'm interested in, because that's what you're going to see on your exam. So top of the list for intoxication is Staph aureus. Staph aureus is the number one cause. Different strains of Staph aureus is the number one cause for food intoxications. So what do I want you to know about Staph aureus? First of all, not all strains can do this. These strains are called enterotoxigenic strains. Entero, as you recall, refers to the intestinal tract. So these strains, they produce toxins. They're called enterotoxins. And here's how it works. These are the things I'm pointing out. I want you to know, right? Imagine you have potato salad. You went to the park. It's the 4th of July. And you have potato salads or meats or whatever sitting in that hot temperature. I mean, it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And somebody made this food, but they had a boil on their hand. And that boil contains that special strain of Staph aureus that can produce these enterotoxins. That's the thing here, okay? So they prepared the food, and then the bacteria got into the food. Now, you haven't consumed the food yet, right? But basically, the organism is growing in potato salad. It's out in the sun, and it's producing those enterotoxins. And then 4 hours later, you come around and you eat this stuff. Well, the toxin's already there. You eat that stuff, well, within about 4 hours or so, you're throwing up. You have severe diarrhea, all right? But pretty much, this ends it's not very critical. Yeah, the diarrhea, that's a critical thing, I guess. But this ends in about a day or so. All right, this resolves pretty rapidly. All right, so again, Staph aureus, the strains that do this, that cause intoxications, are enterotoxigenic strains. They produce enterotoxins. These toxins act in the intestinal tract. These toxins are heat stable. So what I mean, right over here, they're heat stable. You can't destroy them easily. So most of the time to destroy the toxins, you have to boil that stuff. 100 degrees is boiling water, all right? 100 degrees centigrade. You have to boil for 30 minutes. But think about it. Are you going to boil potato salads? Are you going to boil a salad out there? That doesn't occur, all right? Okay, so in any case, I'm going to ignore that phone call. I have a phone call coming. Who's that coming in from? But anyway, all right, because I'm teaching. All right. So what am I? See, that phone call just put me off. So we just talked about Staph aureus. Only the strains that can produce these enterotoxins. Don't forget what that means. Entero refers to the intestinal tract. These are toxins that cause problems in the enteric tract. So again, food stuff, typical potato salads, coleslaw, milk, meat, and fish. Generally, this bacteria can grow pretty nicely in them. All right, don't worry about this. These toxins are called superantigens. Not something for you to be concerned about. Superantigens hyperactivate the immune system. So we haven't talked about it in this class, but don't worry about it. Now, the other two I'm just going to mention in passing because they cause mild diseases. In fact, most of the time you have them, you never know that you have disease. Maybe you have diarrhea for a day, or maybe some mild symptoms, maybe some vomiting, but then it's over with. All right. So the first one on the list is Clostridial food poisoning. What causes this is Clostridium perfringens, and the other one is Bacillus cereus. What causes this, of course, that organism Bacillus cereus, it produces an enterotoxin. Both of those produce enterotoxins, but again, pretty mild condition. I do want you to know one term, emesis or emetic syndrome. So this here is shown in red. All that means is vomiting. All right, so emesis is the clinical term for vomiting. All right. Now, this other one is really important because it can cause a very deadly disease. And you've probably heard about it before, botulism, right? In fact, if you remember when we did gram stains or when we did spore stains, we listed a whole bunch of organisms, aerobic and anaerobic. And in the anaerobic list, we said Clostridium botulinum. I'm sure you remember Clostridium tetani, that causes tetanus. Clostridium difficile causes pseudomembranous colitis. And then we said Clostridium botulinum causes botulism. Well, we're going to talk about this one here. So Clostridium botulinum, it's a gram-positive rod. So you guys all know all about this. Remember you did a spore stain last week? This organism sporulates. So this is a vegetative cell. And just to test you a little bit, it has a vegetative cell. This is the cell that produces the botulism toxin. So when the disease occurs, this is the cell that produces that toxin. Spores are inert. They don't cause disease. They give rise to vegetative cells. And this is just a refresher from what you actually studied last week in the laboratory. So spores are like seeds. Think about they're dormant. They don't cause disease, but they give rise to vegetative cells. And the vegetative cells produce the toxins. Now, you should know this also. This is an endospore, right? So hopefully you remember this. This is inside the mother cell. Okay, so the botulism toxin is an exotoxin. All that means the organism produces this toxin and releases it into the environment. It's one of the most powerful toxins known. And people have done studies on this. 1 pint can eliminate the world's population. 1 ounce can eliminate the US population. So again, it's a very, very nasty toxin. Now, this is an anaerobic organism, Clostridium botulinum. So typically, how do we acquire that? Well, several different ways. Because it's a spore former. Remember, spores, the reservoirs for spores is soil. So imagine somebody has a wound and they're walking through the desert or something, and there's some spores of Clostridium botulinum. Spores get into the wound. And then what can happen, that organism can grow, it sporulates, it germinates, you have the vegetative cell, and now you're producing that disease. But also when it comes to food and waterborne disease, right here, canning things. When you can food, you boil it. And when you boil things, you remove oxygen gas. All right? That's important because if I have very little oxygen back here, an anaerobic organism like Clostridium botulinum can grow very well in this food stuff. So again, as it grows, it produces the toxin. So one of the sources for poisoning is canned foods. All right? Okay. So having said this, how does this toxin work? No, I'm not going to get into detailed mechanisms for you, but I do want you to know just a few basic things about this toxin. First of all, the toxin is preformed. In other words, it's already made before you eat it. It's already in the food. Second, the toxin, unlike the staph toxin, this one is heat labile. In other words, heat can destroy the toxin. 90 degrees, 10 minutes can destroy the toxin. And here's the big thing. I have it in red. This botulism toxin causes flaccid paralysis. So what do I mean by flaccid paralysis? You guys know what spasm is, all right? When you have a muscle that's always moving, contracting, that spasm. Here it's a different case. It's like this, limp, all right? There's no muscle contraction. So what causes this? So I'm going to take you back to your A and P, and I'm sure you remember this. Imagine I want to move my arm. So I'm moving my skeletal muscle or my legs. My brain tells my muscle to move, but how does that occur? You send information to neurons. So let's talk about something called acetylcholine. You've heard that before, right? So acetylcholine are present in these vesicles. So here's a nerve ending. Here's the skeletal muscle. You guys remember the synaptic cleft, right? So right here, this is the space between the muscle and the neuron end. So if you want to move your muscle, skeletal muscle, you have to release acetylcholine. So under normal circumstances, my brain is sending information to my neurons, to my skeletal muscle. It causes the release of acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. Of course, when this occurs, muscle contraction occurs now. Now, here's what the botulism toxin does. It prevents the release of acetylcholine. So let me say that again. The botulism toxin prevents the release of acetylcholine. So therefore, you have no contraction. Let me say that again. The botulism toxin prevents the release of acetylcholine from this neuron. So I don't have muscle contraction. What you end up with is just flaccid paralysis, just limp. Person has no control over the muscle, all right? So when people die because of botulism, primarily it's because of their respiratory muscle collapse, all right? So the respiratory muscles are involved with breathing, of course. If you have respiratory muscle paralysis, people can't breathe, and then of course they can die. Let me show you a few pictures back here of people with different types of botulism caused by different mechanisms here. So take a look at this individual. He has botulism. Notice his face is expressionless. He has no control over the muscles in the face. Why? Because the toxins prevented the release of acetylcholine. Skeletal muscles can't contract. Here's a baby. This is a serious case of infant botulism. So check out babies like this, right? Can't move. Because why? The botulism toxin prevents release of acetylcholine, flaccid paralysis. Again, when people die, including babies, it's because because of respiratory paralysis. Their muscles are not functioning effectively. All right, and here's a case of wound botulism right over here. So somebody had a wound, maybe a cut on the arm or something, walked through the soil, some soil got into the wound, except you had spores of Clostridium botulinum. The spores germinated, all right, to produce the vegetative cells. And of course, the vegetative cells are producing the toxins, the botulism toxin, all right? Now, to treat this is very important. You're not treating the bacteria. Yes, you can use antibiotics to kill the bacteria, but remember what's causing this problem? It's the botulism toxin. So basically, you can use an antitoxin to treat this disease. So people who have botulism, they're given an antitoxin. Basically, it's antibodies that actually neutralize the toxin. All right, I'm sure you guys all heard about Botox and the like. So let me just say a few things about the good things about botulism toxin, if there's any. All right. So botulism, the toxin prevents the release of acetylcholine, and you have no muscle contraction. All right. So let's look at a few cases where this can be of good use. We can use this clinically. Here's an individual with a disease called cervical dystonia. The muscles in the neck are always in spasm. You can literally give Botox per se, and now the person has control over movement, over the neck muscle. Here's another case where this person is spastic. In other words, there's a lot of spasms. In this case, it's in the wrist and fingers. So again, you give a shot of Botox per se, and now that person can move freely. All right, the wrist and fingers and elbows pretty normally. Some people have overactive bladders. So in this case, they urinate really rapidly and basically uncontrollably. And that's because this is, if you guys remember your lecture on the kidneys and the urinary system, right, from last semester, remember the detrusor muscle? Well, this is contracting. It's going to force urine out. You give that person literally Botox, and now the muscles relax. Because why? The botulism toxin causes relaxation of skeletal muscle or muscles in general. All right. Here's another case. Here's an individual who has a condition called blepharospasm. The muscles in the eyelids are always in spasm. You give that person Botox, literally, and guess what now? She has control over her eyes. Of course, what Botox is most known for is for aesthetic purposes. So here's what happens. When we smile a whole lot, right, muscles are being activated, we can create wrinkles. So the more you smile, the more wrinkles you have. So to prevent wrinkles, you can go to these Botox parties, get these shots of Botox. By the way, you have to have very small amounts of this toxin because it can be very toxic. It can actually kill you if you get too much. But nonetheless, you get injections of Botox. It relaxes the muscle, reduces wrinkles. The shots last for about 3 to 4 months. They're pretty expensive. I haven't been to one myself, but maybe I should. But nonetheless, we can use this very serious toxin to help us, first of all, with medical conditions, as you see here, and then with aesthetics, how we look, all right? Let me just say this disease also occurs in animals. In cattle, it's called fodder disease. So this cow basically just laying no control over the muscle. Why? The botulism toxin prevents the release of acetylcholine, no skeletal muscle contraction.
Dr. Bideshi.
This picture was taken in northern Canada. You see about 3 miles of dead mallard ducks. They all ate from the same source, and they all got botulism. So they went to the nearby lake, dipped their heads down to catch fish, and they couldn't bring their heads back up. So they all drowned, and then they washed up on shore. All right, you see how significant this toxin is? So let me just review this stuff. The botulism toxin, okay? It's a toxin that prevents release of acetylcholine. It causes flaccid paralysis. When people die or when animals die, it's mainly because of respiratory paralysis. They can't control the muscles that control breathing. All right? Okay, so that takes care of intoxications. And just to remind you, intoxications are simply this.
Professor Bideshi.
You consume food stuff that contains the toxins already. All right? And then you're affected by it. Yeah, go for it.
In the case of the
Was there a question?
in the case of the lady that is not able to control her eyelids, or the gentleman with the neck issues, how does it give them control of that muscle if essentially with the Botox you're inhibiting the acetylcholine? Like, is there a certain degree of acetylcholine that you give in order to give control, or if I understood correctly, it supposedly cuts off completely acetylcholine? So how does that give them, like, how can she blink if she has Botox? Like, wouldn't her eyes dry out?
Okay, so here's the thing. It's a very good question you asked. So in this case, forget about Botox for a second. All right, this person here has constant spasm. So basically, there's spasm in the neck. That's called cervical dystonia. Same here with the limb, right? So that's spasticity. So we're not even talking about the toxin yet. So again, you have constant release of acetylcholine that causes this problem here. So that's spasms. To relieve this, that's when you give the toxins. So in this case here, these cases, there's too much acetylcholine being released. So there's constant spasm, right? You give Botox, and by the way, you have to actually titrate this pretty well. You can't give too much because that can be toxic. So the doctors, they know how to give exactly what concentrations to give. So you give these individuals botulism toxin, and now you prevent the release of acetylcholine, so now they have normal movement. Does that last forever? No. You have to keep on. So again, it's going to literally help these individuals for a short period of time. But then it starts all over again. You're releasing too much acetylcholine. So you have to give another shot of Botox. Same here. In this case, the eyelids, she has no control over the muscles in the eyelids. Why? Because she's releasing too much acetylcholine. You give Botox, it prevents the release of acetylcholine, and now she can open her eyes. All right? So in this case, this is a good thing because you're actually regulating to some level how much acetylcholine is released. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, cool. Okay, so those are intoxications or examples of intoxication. The 4 important ones, Staph aureus, number 1. All right, and we have Clostridium perfringens, and then Bacillus cereus, very mild disease. And the major one we looked at was just this one here, botulism. So remember, for all of those diseases, the toxins are produced in the stuff that you eat, and now you get disease. I want to move on to infections. So when I say infections, you have to consume not the toxin, but live organisms. And these organisms, they kind of fight with bacteria and other microorganisms in the intestinal tract. And then they outcompete those organisms. They pick up a niche, and now they establish themselves. They produce their toxins, and now disease occurs. So the incubation period is a little longer. In fact, sometimes quite a lot longer compared to intoxications. Just some stats for you. Globally, we have about 500 million cases of infections every year, and about 230,000 people die every year because of diseases we're going to be talking about. We can classify these diseases into 2 types. Inflammatory, so think about the term, there's going to be some inflammation in the intestinal tract, and then invasive gastroenteritis. So invasive, when I say invasive, the organisms are digging into the intestinal tract, digging into tissues so you can see blood in stool, all right? So with inflammatory gastroenteritis, basically people will have watery diarrhea, vomiting, typically fever for 1 to 3 days. And again, typically the small intestines for the inflammatory response, the small intestines are affected. For the invasive gastroenteritis, again, typically what happens, the intestinal mucosa, this is the lining of the intestinal tract. They're invaded. You can have dysentery with blood and mucus in the feces. That's what this means. This primarily occurs in the large intestine, the colon. All right? Okay, so let's go straight forward. For inflammatory gastroenteritis, these are the major organisms I'll be looking at. The one that causes cholera, Vibrio cholera, E. coli, you hear about E. coli outbreaks, Clostridium difficile or C. diff, then really nasty ones back here. Luckily, very few cases every year, less than 1,500 cases or so, but they can be quite deadly, all right? So again, these tables are really cool. Don't ever ignore them because they tell you so much information. Things that half of the stuff I'm going to ask you on the exam is straight from the table, right? First of all, the disease, name of the organism that causes that disease, signs and symptoms, and the types of toxins involved, by transmission primarily through water and food. Treatment, generally, you have to rehydrate an individual. And then again, prevention, just hygiene. All right, so the first disease we're going to be looking at is cholera. I'm sure you probably heard about cholera. Over the past 200 years or so, there have been about 7 pandemics, in other words, worldwide. So we rarely see this disease in the Western Hemisphere. It kind of started back in the East, right here, places like India, in Africa. Then about 200 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, things started migrating to the West. We see very few cases of cholera in the United States, but a few cases in South America. Most of the cases, again, occur in the eastern part of the planet. All right. Okay, so this organism causes cholera. You require a large infectious dose of over about 1 million to 100 million or so. Why? Because when they pass through the stomach, the acid in the stomach actually kills them, right? Now, there are a few things I want you to remember here. And again, we don't get too much into mechanisms. But I do want you to understand what happens when this bacteria infects and when it causes disease. All right, so let's go through this. So here's the bacterium. It gets into the intestinal tract. It's a gram-negative rod. It's kind of spiral organism. And then it starts producing a toxin. That toxin is called an AB toxin. All right? So the bacteria is growing in the intestinal tract. It produces an AB toxin. That toxin binds to a cell. So these are cells that line the intestinal tract. And again, don't worry so much about all these writings here. I want you just to understand what's going on. That toxin binds to cells, but how does it bind? It has a receptor on the target cell. And I do want you to know this one. It's called a GM1 ganglioside. So let's go back and say this again. The bacteria is growing. It's right here. It's producing a toxin. It's an AB toxin. All right? That toxin binds to a receptor on your cells. What is that receptor? That receptor is a GM1 ganglioside. So don't forget that. Ultimately, here's what this does. And again, we're not going to go to mechanism. That's not for this class. But that toxin causes you to secrete ions into the intestinal lumen. All right? So basically, if you remember, where sodium goes, think about physiology, or where ions go, water follows. So imagine I'm pumping more. Usually it's a reverse process here, but now with the toxin, I'm pumping more chloride ions, potassium, sodium into the lumen of the intestinal tract. So I have a massive flow of water into the intestinal lumen. And of course, that results in diarrhea. All right? Significantly so. So let me just review this slide, tell you what I want you to know. Vibrio is caused by, cholera is caused by Vibrio cholera. That organism produces a toxin. It's an AB toxin. What's the receptor for that toxin? These are your cells that have the receptors. That receptor is a GM1 ganglioside. So the toxin binds, and here's what it does ultimately. It reverses the flow of ion. It causes ions to move outside of your body into the intestinal lumen, except big time. Of course, where ions go, like sodium, potassium, chloride, water is going to follow in bulk. All right, so water just moves pretty rapidly into the intestinal tract, and you have this massive diarrhea that occurs. All right, so again, the symptoms that you see, what do I want you to know about this? The major symptoms is water loss. All right, so water loss. So basically, people can lose, think about this. if they rehydrate themselves, 12 liters of water, you know, a 2-liter bottle of Coke, that's this, right? So that's what we buy in the store. But imagine 6 of those every single day. So the bad conditions, people can lose about 12 liters of water per day. That's a ton of water. So compared to any other disease of the intestinal tract, there's nothing like this as far as water loss goes. So the major thing when it comes to cholera is that you have a lot of water loss. Imagine if you're losing water, there's fluid from the blood vessels, and actually you lose it. So people end up with something severe dehydration and something called a hypovolemic shock. All right. So again, this basically have a cardiovascular collapse when people die. By the way, most people recover. Don't get me wrong. People who die, they actually have major dehydration and then hypovolemic shock. Now, of course, at some point, basically the stool is just going to be just liquid. So I want you to know this other term, rice water stool. Every time you hear that term, rice water stool, if ever you cooked rice before, you know that water that's left behind, this is what it looks like. All right, this is right over here. That's rice water stool. Always tie rice, that term, rice water stool, to color. All right? So let me summarize what I've just said here. So you can read all this stuff, but here's a few things I want you to know. There's nothing like cholera when it comes to water loss. People can lose about 12 liters of water per day. So think about it. If you lose all that fluid, especially from your cardiovascular system or your tissues, you're going to be in bad shape. You're going to end up with a condition called hypovolemic shock. Basically, that means low blood volume, all right? And then you end up with cardiovascular collapse and you can die. So major dehydration, nothing like it. So here's some individuals who have this problem, they have cholera. What you see when you pinch, here's one where you can tell somebody's severely dehydrated. When you pinch the skin, it stays, all right? You can see like right over here, okay? That person's severely dehydrated. Think about this, low blood volume. That person ends up with cardiac and renal failure. Too much toxins build up in the bloodstream and they can die, all right? Okay. Now, the next category of things that can cause disease in humans, we're going to focus on E. coli, enteric or GI, gastrointestinal disease. So if you notice on this one here, I have many different E. coli strains. Don't worry about them. I'm going to tell you the ones I want you to know. So today we're going to focus on E-tech and E. These are E. coli strains, all right? I know it sounds kind of strange, but I'm going to show you what I mean. All right, occasionally on the news you see, here's an E. coli outbreak. So what are we talking about? E. coli can be a normal inhabitant of the intestinal tract. You find that normally in the intestinal tract. But there are some strains of E. coli that cause some major diseases. And I'm going to tell you how I want you to remember them, all right? The first one is called E-tech. Stands for enterotoxigenic E. coli. Don't forget the term. So this is a strain of E. coli. It's called E-tech, enterotoxigenic E. coli. Now, this causes a disease called traveler's diarrhea. You probably heard the term Montezuma's revenge, Delhi belly, turkey trot. It's all the same thing, but it's caused by E-tech. So here's how you're going to remember it. T for travelers, T for tech. All right? There are different strains. E-tech, enterotoxigenic E. coli causes traveler's diarrhea. These are areas of the planet where these strains are just common. So people can go traveling, so they come back from these countries, and then a week or two later, then they end up with this problem. But 20%, that's 1 in 5 people who travel to these areas of the planet, end up with this condition. Most of them recover pretty well, not much of a problem. Yeah, they have diarrhea, and it can be severe also, but generally they recover pretty well within a couple of weeks or so. So again, E-tech, all I want you to know, enterotoxigenic E. coli causes traveler's diarrhea. People recover pretty rapidly. The next strain is this one here, E-pec, and here's how you're going to remember it. All right, it stands for enteropathogenic E. coli. This is a major problem in kids. So here's how I remember it. E-pec for pediatric patients. Let me say that again. E-pec can cause some terrible problems in infants, not so much in adults. Adults can get a problem too, but it's worse in infants. It's called enteropathogenic E. coli, causes intestinal disease in infants. So E-tech for T for travelers, PEC, E-pec, P is for pediatric patients. All right? Again, these individuals can lose a lot of water So they can end up with hypovolemic shock. All that means is low blood volume because they're losing so much water. And again, this can be quite fatal in individuals. Maybe 1 to 3% of kids with EPEC infection die. They have severe consequences. All right. Now, the other one on the list is the one that you probably know by C. diff. If you work in a hospital, you probably heard the term before. It's C. diff. All right, DIFF. That's the name of an organism. It's not a disease. And again, this was mentioned in the laboratory. Clostridium difficile actually causes a disease called pseudomembranous colitis. All right, so let me tell you a little about this disease. Here's an individual who has this problem, pseudomembranous colitis. This is the colon. You see all these areas here, it's inflamed. That's colitis, inflammation of the colon. That's what it means. It's a false membrane. You're destroying tissues. You're causing this problem here, pseudomembranous colitis. In general, in the United States, we have about 330,000 people every year who get this problem. Basically, about 30,000 people die. So this is like 1 in 10 people die when they have this condition. All right? So how do people get this disease? First of all, one of the major reasons why is because they've been on antibiotics too long. So clindamycin, for example, fluoroquinol, these are examples of antibiotics. Here's what those antibiotics do over time. They wipe out the normal flora in the intestinal tract. So basically, you have normal good bacteria. You're on antibiotic therapy for a long time. You start destroying these bacteria, and then this one pops up. So there's no competition. So Clostridium pops up, and it produces a toxin. All right? In fact, it produces 2 toxins. One is an enterotoxin that causes diarrhea, and the other is a cytotoxin. A cytotoxin produces the problem that you see right here. And that, of course, is colitis. Now, this can be pretty bad. Again, if you work in a hospital and a person has this, you know this. Their stool is foul-smelling, it's liquidy, it's green, all right? But this is what they're facing. This major problem is pseudomembranous colitis. Now, it's in some patients, check this out. This is the colon. This is called a megacolon, all right? So this is quite toxic. Look at all that inflammation. Generally, what's done, you have to remove that. So surgically, you have to remove the colon, reattach everything to get rid of the problem. So this, again, think about the death. 1 in 10 people die because these conditions can be quite severe. All right? Okay. So again, keep in mind what happened here. Literally, you reduce the normal flora in the intestinal tract, and then this one pops up. So how do you take care of this problem? Well, you can give the patient antibiotics, but antibiotics might make the problem worse because you're killing out natural flora. In fact, you can give the patient antibiotic, but here's what you want to do. You want to replenish the intestinal flora, all right? In other words, you want that intestinal microbiome to repair itself. So I know you might laugh at this actually, but seriously, you can take stool from a near relative that's normal. In other words, it contains all the bacteria that you need, and have this individual actually take that pill, either from the rare end or swallow this pill. Here's the whole. This pill contains the bacteria, I should say, that would replenish the normal flora in the intestinal tract. All right, so let me go through this one more time with you. Clostridium difficile causes a really bad problem. 2% of the population actually has this organism already in the intestinal tract. Here's what happens most of the time. A person is on antibiotic therapy for a long time. Clindamycin is an antibiotic, is strongly linked to this. So you destroy the normal bacteria in the intestinal tract.